6 we tried in succession, each more encouraging than the last. That is how the methods of salvation from the Toba catastrophe devised by the Isu were introduced in Assassin's Creed Revelations 11 years ago, and with this video that we are releasing as part of the celebrations for Access the Animus 9th anniversary, we're going to try and explain once and for all these solutions that we have mentioned ever so frequently in our videos. We're going to discuss what the 7 methods were, why they are still relevant in the most recent and likely future stories of the franchise after 11 years, which ones of them were successful and how they play into the overarching narrative of the franchise even today. So strap in and get ready. This is our full explanation of the 7 methods of salvation during the Isu era. While they still were engulfed in their war against humanity, a war that started 10 years before the catastrophe hit the Earth and that hasn't been referenced in the recent releases that much, to be honest, through the use of the calculations, the Isu predicted that a coronal mass ejection from the Sun would have hit the Earth at some point in the future, and in order to avert that, when they still thought that they could actually save the world, their best scientists conjured up several solutions that were aimed at saving the world and the entire Isu civilization with it. This global attempt to avert the disaster, later known as the Toba catastrophe, were spearheaded by the leaders of the Isu society, or at least the leaders of the Greco-Roman Isu as we're calling them on the channel, that is Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, who were respectively holding the titles of Father of Understanding, Mother of Wisdom, and Sacred Voice. Many different solutions were developed in an equal number of vaults scattered across the world and located underground in order to avoid the human Isu war that was raging on the surface, and also to leave a testament should the methods fail and the catastrophe hit the Earth. But eventually, the information concerning all of these potential solutions was conveyed on the Grand Temple near modern-day Turin, New York, where Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva chose the most promising solutions amidst the available pool, and they selected 6 of them, the original 6 methods of salvation. So the original plan was to try and save the Earth or as many Isu as possible at any cost, and as the first solutions kept failing, the following ones were darker and darker, but it was already too late. The Isu had been too embroiled in their war with the humans and their calculations came all too late, and thus eventually the solar flare did hit the Earth and only a few Isu and humans survived the impact. But what were these solutions about? Why have we been referencing them for quite a while in our videos? Why are they at the core of most of the Isu stories after more than a decade, even with the recent Dawn of Ragnarok DLC? Let's have a look at all of the 7 methods of salvations then, so we can have a primer that can come in handy at any time should the future stories reference them again, while also going in detail as to how they worked and how some of them failed. The first solution that the Isu scientists thought of was the creation of 4 towers that had the objective of receiving the energy of the solar flare and then drawing it onto the Grand Temple where it would have been dissipated. Sadly though, as Juno put it, even with the knowledge, technology and workforce at their disposal, it would have taken the Isu too long, hinting that the entire project would have taken more than 1,000 years to be completed, a time that the Isu did not have, and so while the construction of the first tower had started, it was soon after abandoned, and Jupiter, Juno and Minerva moved on to other, more promising solutions. As we saw in our recent analysis of the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the first tower was originally built in the area within the mythological vale called Svartalfheim by the local workforce, that is the local Isu represented in the DLC as dwarves, until the method was deemed a failed solution. The leader of the North African Isu, Surtur, thought otherwise though, and actually started an invasion on the territory in order to seize control of the failed tower and to repurpose it into a weapon of mass destruction that could hit any area of the world. As we saw in the aforementioned analysis though, the intervention of the Isu Odin thwarted Surtur's plan, but in doing so he inadvertently used the tower to start the process that would have eventually led to the Toba catastrophe. In her Assassin's Creed 3 speech, Juno mentioned that while she, Jupiter, and Minerva worked on the other solutions, a few other Isu returned and tried to continue and automate the process, and by this others, she actually meant herself. As we already mentioned in our video fully dedicated to the first tower during the events shown in the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, Juno was eventually able to automate the construction process of the 4 towers and have it work in the centuries and millennia after the Toba catastrophe hit the Earth, potentially through the use of robots and machines, considering how she says that metal might finish what flesh could not. And the 4 complete towers that by 2012 had ended up underground were the actual method that, as part of the so-called Global Aurora Borealis device, was able to avert the so-called second disaster, the catastrophe that was meant to hit the Earth in 2012, and thus Juno used those towers as a bargaining chip with Desmond in order to be freed into the world. Seeing that they couldn't absorb the energy of the solar flare, the Isu tried instead to repel it through an electromagnetic field encompassing the entire world. This was the second method of salvation, and the idea came from the pieces of Eden named as Shards of Eden and later Rings of Eden that had been created by the Asgardian Isu Idun, and were essentially rings that created an electromagnetic shield that would protect the user from incoming physical and energy-based projectiles by deflecting them. The idea was then to replicate the same technology on a worldwide scale, but within the short amount of time that they had before the catastrophe, they lacked the energy to create such a shield. According to Juno, the Isu then tried to use the technology on a scale half the world, then a quarter, a sixth, an eighth, and a tenth, but they were never able to conjure up the proper amount of energy, and thus this solution was abandoned too, even if Juno hinted that maybe, in time, a city might have been spared by using this solution, and while this hint never came to fruition in the franchise and could then be repurposed at some point in the future, we have already seen some tests of such shield being done across the Asgardian Isu territory. The third method of salvation involved using the pieces of Eden and especially the Apples of Eden, once again presumably created by the Isu Idun. While using them, the Isu found out that along with controlling the target's minds, these artifacts had another use. When a sufficient number of people, of human slaves if you will, looking at the video here, was ordered to believe in something through the use of an apple, their thought took shape. It actually influenced the real world, and it also meant that matter could be created out of thought, which is possibly one of the craziest abilities of these artifacts. As an example, Juno stated that 100 minds could destroy a wall or make it disappear and conversely create a tree out of thin air, but we have seen other examples of this throughout the franchise where some images or illusions created through the apple actually had direct consequences on the real world, such as Altair creating illusionary assassins that did kill real guards, or Giovanni Borgia bending walls and creating eagles in Project Legacy. So following this idea, the Isu thought of once again replicating this on a global scale by sending an apple into space, aiming it towards the Earth, and trying to control tens and hundreds of thousands of people and causing all of them to think a phrase so simple in its content and so full of hope to almost look naive and desperate: "Make us safe." They hoped that having everyone wish their safety through the apple would have made that a reality, but the way the solution was executed, it didn't work. And as it happened with the electromagnetic field, the Isu tried to improve the method by working on the quantity rather than the concept. So they sent a dozen of pieces of Eden to space to try the method again, but in this case they had to face some more issues. Their intention was to use more pieces of Eden to properly convey their message towards all the sentient living beings on Earth, but this carried the problem of the difficulty of controlling all the pieces from a distance and then conveying the proper message to all the human slaves, here described as directing the beam, speaking the words, and enthralling the world. Nonetheless, the third solution proved to be a failure too, and thus it was abandoned along with the pieces of Eden sent to space for it, so much so that one of them ended up on the moon and was later retrieved by the Templars with the Apollo 11 mission. We're getting into the good stuff now. As the Isu realized that they couldn't physically protect the planet anymore, they tried to think outside the box. And they tried a minor thing, you know, time travel. They tried to go back and change the past, but they were not able to do that, again proving that time travel is not a thing in Assassin's Creed. What the Isu could do was looking at the future, that is, using the so-called calculations in order to predict their future. They used the Eye, otherwise called the divination device, that was a huge computational device that allowed them to peer into the most plausible futures by changing a myriad of variables in order to see if there was even one chance, one future that would have allowed them to survive the impending catastrophe, but the result was always the same, with the solar flare hitting the Earth. Thus, again, the Isu moved on to other solutions, but as it was stated in Revelations, the calculations were Minerva's domain, so she stayed and continued trying to work on the method and see what she could make out of it. As the catastrophe drew near, she stopped exploring the various potential futures and instead began to worry about the humans that would have survived the Toba catastrophe and would have had to endure the second disaster in the modern day, and thus she decided to use the Eye to send messages across time. That is where we see her in the Jotunheim arc of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, worried about what will happen to the humans and trying her best to send her message across time to Ezio Auditore, which she eventually did, making it so that it reached Desmond Miles in 2012. But as Juno said, Minerva hid her messages across time where nobody might find them, save from Desmond, who was the addressee of the message, and those within the Grand Temple in Turin, which again are the scientists that worked on the 6 methods, including Jupiter and Juno herself, who in turn used the Eye to send other messages across time and have Desmond run his fool's errand and eventually sacrifice himself in exchange for Juno's own release into the world. Oh, Odin too got to know about Minerva's attempts, but he was, interested in something else? I'm talking about the 7th method, of course, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. The Isu were getting closer and closer to the catastrophe and their solutions were still not working, so instead of protecting the planet through the protections and shields from the 1st and 2nd method, they thought of protecting themselves from the effect of the solar flare because, as Juno said, they were still made of flesh and that made them frail. Originally, in Assassin's Creed 3, it was established, or at least hinted at, that the 5th method involved the Isu deciding to modify their body through the use of bioengineering and an unspecified type of machines that could seemingly be injected in the body through a syringe. Some type of nanomachines, if you will. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag actually retroactively changed or upgraded that, establishing that the 5th method actually involved transferring the Isu's consciousness into a machine and through it into the bodies of their slaves and war enemies, that is, the humans. This is where the Isu first dabbled with the concept of transference or transcendence, as we'll see. Of course, this wasn't an amazing prospect, but at the same time the solution had to be tested somehow, and it was Aita, Juno's husband, Isu's scientist and overseer of the Pieces of Eden, who volunteered for the task. In itself, this already felt like a last resort method, and so this was a highly suffered decision. In Assassin's Creed 3, we can see Juno interacting with a character represented as a normal human here, which through the new interpretation from Black Flag was the human that was going to host Aita's consciousness all the while Jupiter walks by. We then see the human lying down on some sort of bed as Juno looks intensely concerned for what might happen to the mind of her husband. Juno then lifts her worried eyes on Jupiter, who had appeared on the scene earlier, and that we can see here finally injecting Aita's consciousness into the human body, which reacts abruptly to the sudden addition of an Isu mind and with several convulsions. This immediately showed that the solution had not worked as intended, and thus Jupiter walked away, while Juno of course tried to comfort and stay beside what remained of her husband. In her words, while the body might survive, Aita's mind had become fragile, meaning that his pain was so extreme to lead him close to insanity. The pain was so intense for Aita that for days, weeks and even months he had begged Juno to set him free from his suffering, while Juno on the other hand was imploring him to wait until she and other Isu colleagues would have found another solution, but in a very grieving line that did show how much she loved her husband, Juno stated that there wasn't one. Not for him and not for them, and thus she was forced to kill him. But was that true? Were there no other ways to save Aita? As a matter of fact, there was one, and AC4 slightly backtracked or built upon this powerful scene of Assassin's Creed 3 too. In there, we actually learned that already at this point, before killing Aita and before even testing the 6th method, Juno had already at least planned in detail her version of the 7th method, that is the creation of the Aita Sages, so much so that she told Aita of her plan in his very final moments, but we'll get there later in the video. At this point though, Aita is dead, and while the ESO scientists are still to test the 6th solution, Juno is already planning her schemes not only about Aita's rebirth, but also about her own survival. The catastrophe is upon the Isu now, and thus they are resorting to everything they can think of, whatever the cost. Seeing that implanting their consciousness into a human body proved to be unsuccessful because again flesh is frail, they decided with the 6th solution to now transfer their consciousness into some way more durable vessels, such as the entire Grand Temple and its machinery, which Juno even directly points at and sometimes talks from without even having her hologram around. According to Juno, who had learned all about the consciousness transfer technology from the work of the Isu Consus, it was easy enough to transfer the mind or soul in this new type of durable containers, which actually work kinda like hard drives, but when she talks about getting out of those vessels, her tone of voice gets serious, as that required something wrong, something that went against the ethics, which back during the times of Assassin's Creed 3 was presumed to be the death of somebody else. So because of the high cost required to implement this method, the ESO scientists abandoned this too, but Juno back then wondered were they right to turn away, and she's asking it because that was the method that she decided to use in order to survive the Toba catastrophe, which proved to be successful too, and because she copied her consciousness in the Grand Temple machinery, her only way to get out was for somebody to be sacrificed, a part that Desmond played too well, even though now through Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we got to see that Desmond wasn't fully killed, as his consciousness was actually transferred to the Grand Temple machinery and then to the Grey. So the current explanation for the method is that while more than one consciousness can get in, for a consciousness to get out, another one has to get in, which is unsurprisingly very similar to how the Salakar artifact worked in the Dawn of Ragnarok expansion of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. In fact, as we hinted at in our analysis of the DLC, the Salakar in Dawn of Ragnarok may or may not be identified as the very same sphere that Desmond touches in Assassin's Creed 3, or a more ancient and refined version of it coming from the ancient Isu people that were introduced within the DLC. It's interesting to see that Dawn of Ragnarok shows that after the original 6 methods of salvation had been deemed ineffective, Juno did put her hands on the Salakar artifact thanks to Odin, and sometime after that she ended up within the Grand Temple, which, as shown in Assassin's Creed 3, did indeed contain a pedestal that was very similar to the Salakar, which could in turn hint at her actually taking the artifact to the Grand Temple in her frantic escape from Jupiter and Minerva, where she was able to make the Salakar/pedestal properly work, and that may be why we're able to see it working perfectly in Assassin's Creed 3, as Juno's consciousness gets out while Desmond's one gets in. Nonetheless, the durable technology being able to hold Isu consciousnesses isn't limited to the Grand Temple machinery. The Facebook game Project Legacy and Assassin's Creed Syndicate, for example, did show that the Isu Consus transferred his mind in the first Shroud of Eden prototype, which allowed him to survive the Toba catastrophe, though he was never able to get out of the artifact until it was destroyed. Valhalla also introduced that Alethea's consciousness was transferred to the Staff of Hermes Trismegistus, which allowed her to survive the catastrophe as well, so we might see this method being used again in the future if tied to some other durable vessels. As we mentioned earlier, the 7th method was conceived by Juno at the very least before the testing of the 5th one, the bioengineering one. This new method involved the transfer of the Isu consciousnesses not in a vessel but within the human DNA, where they would have been coded and would have lied dormant until they would have resurfaced in a human being under specific conditions, where the Isu consciousness would have battled it out with the original human one for control of the body. Examples of this are of course the Aita Sages and the Asgardian ones that we have discussed so many times in our videos. In order to work, this method in its original conception required some adequate machinery, a serum, a catalyst, the genetic material of the original Isu, and a human fetus where the Isu's DNA and consciousness would have been implanted, resulting in a manipulation of the human genome. The fetus would have then been grown and/or released into the world likely after the Toba catastrophe, and after several generations where the Isu DNA and consciousness kept a recessive trait, a trigger would have activated under specific conditions, causing the Isu DNA to have a dominant trait, which would have altered the genetic makeup of the human host, changing the physical attributes into that of the Isu whose DNA became dominant, sometimes maintaining the original sex, other times changing it, while also having their consciousness and memories slowly surface within the individual and try to take control of them, de facto having the Isu reborn in a human vessel, with their mind being up to date to the time when it was transferred into the original fetus. Consider it as a safe state of the Isu consciousness and genetic memory. Anything happening after that wouldn't have been recorded and passed on. However, the concept of this new method of salvation once again came with some practical and ethical issues. Practically, the resurgence of the Isu consciousness along with the human one within the same individual would have caused a clash between the two, with the human host most likely not being able to understand what they were seeing in the glimpses from the original Isu past and subsequently going mad as a result of that. Ethically, Jupiter and especially Minerva believed that using this new method devised by Juno, and thus adding the Isu minds to the human DNA, would very likely course correct the history of mankind itself, bringing chaos at the very least, if not more, and because of that, they locked Juno's research of this solution, including the serum, within the Grand Temple, while also banishing her from the temple and the city built over it. So as we already discussed in our video analysis, Odin stole the 7th method, making it available for himself and the other Asgardian Isu that were among his circle of friends. The original version of the method, the one stolen and then used by Odin, involved a single rebirth of the Isu, and presumably at an approximated specific time, considering how all the Asgardian Isu were reborn more or less across the 9th century CE or shortly before that. But that wasn't the only version of the method, of course. Once back in control of the serum and the catalyst after Odin stole them, Juno was finally able to use this method to have her husband Aita reborn, but as she had already planned during the development of the 5th method, she was going to modify the original concept of the 7th method in order to obtain a different result. She would have also tampered with the human DNA, adding Aita's DNA inside of it, again as a recessive recurrence, but in this case, Juno made it so that when the proper specific conditions were met, Aita's rebirth would have happened multiple times through the human generations, sometimes even with more than one rebirth instance in the same historical period. These were called sages, or Aita sages to be more specific, and were easily identifiable because, as we mentioned earlier, they did bear some physical traits of the original Isu that they were based off, that is Aita, with such traits being namely anisocoria and heterochromia, that is an unequal size of the eye's pupils and a variation of the color of the eyes themselves. On the contrary, the reborn Asgardian Isu were not officially called sages and as of now don't have an official name, though we have called them Asgardian sages at times for the convenience's sake. But whatever the case, they too were identifiable not only from physical traits like the shape of their face, the voice, etc., but also from a mark on their neck that matched the place where the DNA of the original Asgardian Isu was extracted by the 7th method machinery. And that was it for our full explanation about the 7 methods of salvation created by the Isu, the various degrees of success that they obtained, and the consequences that they are still having on the current narrative of the franchise. Do you guys think that there's still some narrative potential to extract out of them? Would you expect them to still have a role in the future games? Let us know in the comments below. I for once was pretty surprised to see how the first method, that is Juno's failed towers, was repurposed temporarily for a very different and much darker purpose in the recent Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, which was pretty much one of the most interesting aspects of the DLC itself. So if you'd like to know all about it, we do have a dedicated video analyzing all of its details. Thanks for watching and for celebrating our 9th anniversary with us, and we'll see you in our next video.